All right, guys. Greg Everett, Ursula Garza, here once again.
Hey.
Weightlifting Life Podcast, your favorite. Everybody's dying, waiting 2 weeks at a time for these episodes, but for now, at least, you guys are just going to have to deal with it. Before we get started, why don't you guys go check out our sponsor for this episode, Health IQ, at healthiq.com/catalyst. These guys will get you better rates on life insurance, especially important for those of us who are weightlifters or train, who tend to have higher BMIs. My BMI says that I'm clinically obese. So they're going to help you get rates that are appropriate for your actual degree of health rather than letting you subsidize a bunch of unhealthy people. Check them out, healthiq.com/catalyst. All right, we've got poor Rasmus here, which again we're going to push to the end. But I promise, Rasmus, we're going to get to you in this episode. You've been bumped for the last 2 episodes, so we will get it. Make sure you guys go subscribe to this thing on iTunes or Google Play, whatever you listen on. Please rate it. Please go give it 5 stars. If you're going to rate it, just give it 5 stars.
If you're
don't
there.
even think about using another number of stars. There's really no point. Don't be the guy on YouTube who thumbs down every video. All of our videos have one thumbs down on them.
Yeah,
it's always that one
it's like
guy.
the Facebook pages that like somebody goes and rates you with like 2 stars, and you go down and they're like from Tokyo. You've never met them. They don't know you. They don't know who you are, and they just kind of randomly go in and put something negative.
Just
those
so
negative
many
people
angry
floating
people
around the
in
world.
the world.
I know. Don't be one of those.
I'm angry, but righteously
Yeah, let
so.
Greg and I be those. We got that covered. Y'all be nice.
All right. Well, we're both a mess today. We're both exhausted and allergies and what have you. So this is either going to be a spectacularly dull show or spectacularly exciting. So far, I'm leaning towards the dull side.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, our pre-conversation before we came on the air suggests that it may be informative, but not very exciting.
It's not looking good, folks.
Informative, yeah.
No.
Yeah, this may be the one to skip.
We'll get it together.
Not the one to rate.
Game face.
Not the one to rate.
Yeah.
Okay, game face. Josh.
Yes, Josh. Josh asks, I'm new to weightlifting and having trouble with the pull in the snatch and the clean. Is mobility the only limiting factor, or are there other ways to improve actively pulling yourself under the bar? Josh, mobility is not the only limiting factor, although it could very well be a limiting factor. So the way I look at this in terms of mobility is that if you are lacking mobility and therefore the receiving positions of the snatch or the clean are uncomfortable or in any way limited, that of course is going to hurt your ability to pull under the bar, especially pull under into a deep position. But on top of that, though, you have kind of this idea of drag. So in other words, if you're inflexible, if you're immobile, it's you can't move as quickly into a position. So let's say that if you load yourself up in an overhead squat, you get some weight on there, you really let gravity help force you into that bottom position. You can get there, but it's difficult. So you're going to have drag, or in that turnover, if you have limited kind of combination of internal rotation and abduction at the shoulder, you're going to have drag on the system. So it's going to be harder to move your body parts through those ranges to get into that final position. And so, yes, that will slow you down. Any thoughts on mobility specifically on that one, Ursula?
Mobility, no. I mean, obviously, mobility can be an issue. So, but as you said, it's not the only limiting factor. What, I just noted in my little notes that I wrote here, what you're calling drag is that, there's 3 things for me: speed, other than this mobility, speed, the actual bar path, and your comfort in the bottom position. If any of those is lacking, then pulling under a bar in either lift is going to be difficult. So, I mean, if you're just not fast, you can work on getting faster under the bar, doing things like, drop snatch without a dip and drive, or doing pull unders on either lift, what you call tall snatches, right?
Yep.
Or tall cleans.
I think also dead hang, snatch, and clean is another name for them.
Sure. I mean, and if they're all the same, then it doesn't matter what you call them. It just matters that you do them. Um,
But so
I think and then comfort. Like if you're reticent to get into the bottom position because it's not a comfortable position, I think that inherently slows you down. I think injury obviously creates the same type of hesitancy. And then your bar path. Like if you're not certain where the bar is going to end up, I think that creates some hesitancy. So I would say like this kind of, and of course, I never want to give just the 3 or just the 4 because then I always add something. But I think speed under the bar, the actual bar path and trajectory, if that's not tight and predictable, and then comfort, which may in part be related to mobility and or injury, any of those things are compromised, and your speed under the bar becomes compromised.
Yeah. All right. So we're gonna break this down even more for Josh and the his brethren in difficulties pulling under. So mobility. You know what? Get your mobility better. If you're even asking that question, I'm assuming you probably have some mobility limitations. But Ursula had a good word there, comfort. So there's a difference between being mobile enough to sit into a deep receiving position and being comfortable there, which I would equate with being stable. I would kind of consider in this context, at least, those two things are pretty synonymous. So in other words, can you receive a snatch in the bottom position and say, hold it there for 5 seconds? Or do you hit the bottom and bounce out of there and try to get done with it as fast as possible and drop the bar? Because
it's one of my pet
it's
peeves is seeing people try to get out of positions before they're even in them. You see it in the jerk, you see it in the snatch.
Yeah, and that's usually a giveaway that position is not stable and not comfortable. And those are the exact people who really, more than anyone else, needs to be holding those receiving positions. So that's like one of the first things I'll have someone do. Like, oh, I'm unstable in the snatch. Well, hold every single snatch in the bottom for 3 seconds before you stand up. Right. And then, you know what? Hold it another 2 or 3 seconds when you are stood up, and just, accumulate that time with the bar and, developing that stability, that comfort, because, Ursula made the perfect point. If you're not comfortable, you're not going to be confident. And so that's number one, get that mobility, get that comfort, that stability. And you can do that with, all your typical receiving position lifts. So for snatch, you're looking at overhead squat, all the snatch balance variations, snatch push press, press in snatch, basically anything that's strengthening and stabilizing that position. For the clean, it's pretty much front squat, but I would say also pause front squats would be a big one to really build that postural strength and that stability and that comfort.
Something like a SOTS press too.
Yep. Yeah. And that especially if you have an issue with being able to keep that upper back extended and strong, that a SOTS press, which that term gets thrown around a lot. And a lot of us use it to kind of say to mean a press behind the neck in a snatch grip, but technically that is a jerk grip press from the front in the bottom of a clean position. And it is not, as someone well known on the internet once wrote, called a socks press, like SOX, like red socks, black socks. Anyway, so that's your first element, that comfort and stability and mobility. And then beyond that, though, is, Ursula kind of alluded to these things, is you kind of need to diagnose what the cause is beyond that, because there are different kind of components to that movement under the bar. So I kind of look at it, look at the snatch. I would say there's 3 basic components to the movement under the bar. There's the initial, change of direction and pull down, which I believe should be an active movement with the upper body. And that is going to be, that elbows high and out movement. Not necessarily getting to that maximum 90-90 position. Virtually no one is going to do that in an actual snatch, but the intent to get there and that partial range is going to be at least part of what keeps you in the bar in close proximity and ensures that you have that good bar path that Ursula was talking about. So for things like that, looking at snatch high pulls, especially from the hang or even from like a high hang vertical chest position, muscle snatches and tall snatches, I'd say those would be your big ones for working on that initial pull. of your body downward with the arms. Any other ones you can think of for working on that specific element?
We've got this, that what they call no feet, no hook. I call a muscle squat snatch. A muscle squat snatch is really good at getting you, because the bar is not moving up very fast because it doesn't have contact. You have to move under very quickly. And so, and maybe beginners, not necessarily is it useful, but as you get further along, if you're trying to get faster and faster and going under the bar, then I think that's a really good exercise. I've mentioned this exercise before, but starting in the power position, a muscle squat snatch, it's like the analogous movement of what a heaving snatch balance would be to a snatch balance.
Yep.
The muscle squat snatch is to the power position or hip snatch. So it's just there's no foot movement. Your feet are already there. You stand straight up, you dip down, elevate, and go under without your feet actually moving out. And it makes you have to create a really exact bar path. I don't know if do we have a video of that on your site now?
No.
Because when I'm in Malaysia, I'll send you one. I leave to Malaysia tomorrow, so I don't have time to do one today. But I'm going to send you one so we can put up, because I've mentioned it a couple of times. And I'm going to make like somebody famous do it.
Okay. All right. Make sure you hold your damn phone sideways. Don't be one of those knuckleheads who sends me videos with a freaking vertical video. I can't stand
I'm totally going to do that.
Ugh. Fired. Okay. So second component would be the turnover itself. So you've already begun accelerating your body downward and kind of preserving that existing upward speed of the bar, which is important to keep in mind. Is that active pull of the body under the bar is not just moving your body down. It's helping that bar to continue with its upward motion. And so that preservation of that existing speed is pretty much as important as moving the body down. But so once you've done that, you've got the actual turnover of the arms. And this is true for the snatch and the clean. In the snatch, obviously the idea is that you're trying to keep your elbows elevated, turn the arm, basically go from internal to external rotation of the upper arm, and bring that bar and body into their relative positions that you'll finish in. So that bar is basically going behind the neck, trunk is moving down, hips are moving down, and trunk is leaning forward very slightly to get into that final receiving position. And so, exercises for that, definitely muscle snatch or snatch long pull, which if you're not clear on that, my terminology, a muscle snatch, I don't care if you use a hook grip and it'll contact the hip just like a snatch. A snatch long pull is basically what I consider a muscle snatch with no hook grip and with no contact at the body. So it's much more upper body dependent and much more vertical extension.
And if you do that same movement with a full squat, then you really feel the action of the arms on the bar, and hopefully timing wise, you get it right.
Yep.
And I think that's another thing that we didn't mention. And you keep saying like the change of direction, but the timing of the change of the direction, like when to know you're at the end of the pull and pull under,
right,
is important as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that kills people is as weights increase, they get more and more anxious about getting under the bar. Say, well, it's heavier, so I got to get under faster. It's like, no, you have to get under just as fast, but you can't get under a bar that's not adequately elevated and accelerated upward first. Like you have to have that discipline and that patience to finish that upward movement before you change directions and pull under. And so, for that muscle snatch, the muscle squat snatch, especially probably from that kind of high hang position that Ursula was talking about, tall snatch, pretty much anything from the high hang or like a dip or, power position, whatever you call it, is going to help with that stuff. And then the very final element that I would put into the snatch, which is not really present in the clean, would be that punch under. So it's really converting this movement into a perfectly vertical finish. So you're punching straight up against the bar, squatting straight down, and kind of basically pushing away from the bar to push yourself into the bottom. And so Ursula already mentioned that drop snatch, which is basically a snatch balance with no leg movement at all. All you're doing is pushing yourself down. So you have to be extremely quick and aggressive. But pretty much any snatch balance variation is going to be helpful for that. And that'll help with that timing too of that final part, is learning how to lock those elbows out as quickly as possible rather than, waiting to feel the weight of the bar crushing you before you actually react and push up on it. That's going to be way too late. So I would say those are your kind of 3 physical components there that you need to work on, and some exercises for them. We've got the comfort and stability, which is going to lead to the confidence. And then Ursula, you kind of talked about this, but that confidence is also going to allow aggression. And I think that's one of the things that drives me insane, is that you'll see people who explode. I mean, they just go bananas pulling upward, extending hips and knees. And they put all this speed and elevation into the bar. And then it's like their entire body, it's like they just go unconscious for a second, and their whole body just goes limp, and they just fall down aimlessly under the bar. Yes, they're limp and flaccid and probably a little moist.
We call them lazy.
Yeah,
often. I'll say that's just a lazy turnover.
So you just check out, and so that's the key too, is understanding is that pull under has to be just as aggressive, just as precise, just as intentional as the rest of the lift. You don't get to lift the bar up and then just fall down and hope it lands perfectly in position and doesn't kill you. So pretty much all those exercises, any high hang, tall snatch, high blocks, anything where you're basically limited in how much upward speed and elevation you can get. So you have to be extremely aggressive and well timed in that change of direction. That pull under is going to be helpful for kind of developing that aggression. Any other thoughts on that one?
No, I think we covered it.
No, we're good. We got the words limp, flaccid, and moist all in there.
Lazy.
One way or the other, lazy.
You've offended a bunch of people.
Yeah. If you got a poor third pull, it's just because you're a terrible person, is what Ursula is saying, not me.
Yeah. You're generally lazy. You didn't figure it out.
Get a job.
You just can't get to the finish line. You put all the effort in the first,
and then you trip right before the finish line.
And then you just walk in on the last 10.
Or as we used to say a lot, you shit the bed.
That's so gross.
Well, it's not meant to be delightful. All right. Are we ready for Trent?
I think I'm ready for Trent.
I'm ready for Trent. All right. Trent asks, hi, I was wondering if you could recommend some program guidelines for a time-poor weightlifter. I like that term. Mm-hmm. I only have a maximum of 45 minutes of lifting, and I find it hard to get into the groove because I try and cram too much in. Any thoughts would be appreciated. Man, you got to slow your life down, Trent. 45 minutes.
There goes your warm-up.
Yeah. Well, actually, conveniently enough, I just posted a warm-up video that it takes start to finish 5 minutes flat. So
now we're down to 40.
You can get
that
40
minutes.
So here's what I would say. Number one, and you already mentioned it here. You're trying to do too much. So really pare it down. You're gonna have to be very discerning and decide, what are your real priorities? What do you truly need to work on, and what can you live without? Which is, there's quite a few. I do this with myself too. It's like, oh, suddenly I have 12 exercises per day. This is probably going to be a great program. And
that's never happened to me.
Yeah, Ursula's like,
I usually do 2, and then 2, yeah, snatch and back squat, and then if there's time for something else, I'll, maybe it'll
do some
get
curls.
In.
So a couple things to think about. Number one is, like I said, prioritizing. Really pare it down to what you truly need to work on, which is probably going to be the things you don't like as much. But you are going to have to stick, to snatch, clean, and jerk and their basic variations, pulls and squats and maybe a couple basic pressing exercises. Another way to get more stuff in is complexes. Right. So with a single exercise in a single set, you can really get multiple exercises in there. So you're doing, snatch pull plus overhead squat. Boom. You got 3 exercises right there. Clean plus front squat plus push press plus jerk, or, power jerk plus jerk, or, you know, a number of things like that. Hell, you can even do clean plus jerk dip squat, you know, plus jerk. There's a lot of ways you can throw in complexes to kind of address multiple elements while still getting those core, you know, competition lifts in there. And of course, those things, you can change them week to week. You don't have to stick with the same thing for 6 months.
Yeah, I think if you're only training, I mean, we don't know how many days a week he's training 45 minutes, but let's assume it's something like
hopefully
4 or
more
5.
than one.
Huh?
Hopefully more than one.
Yeah, hopefully more than 2. Like, I mean, he could do something like, you know, 2 technical movements, so a snatch movement, a clean and jerk movement, and a strength movement, and then the next day do a technical movement, 2 strength movements, and then the next day do a technical movement, a strength movement, an accessory movement, and then just like rotate those based on what he needs the most help with. So if he's, you know, better at the snatch, then maybe you're doing more clean and jerk on your technical days. If you're obviously weaker, then you may, and you're good technically, you may want to spend more time on strength.
Right.
And then the accessory work obviously gets somewhat sidelined unless you're going to incorporate it into, I mean, a good thing to do would be something like a power clean push press plus jerk. So you get some push presses in there.
Yep.
Anyways, I think that
and
those are some options.
Another way to break it down, which would be even simpler, would be, you know, let's say worst case scenario, you have 45 minutes a day, 2 days a week. You got a snatch day and you got a clean and jerk day. And even if you have more days than that, you can still kind of use that basic premise. So, you know, day 1, you're going to do a snatch or some kind of variation, potentially, you know, complexes to get those extra things in there. Snatch pulls or deadlift or some kind of pulling variation, and then some kind of squat. And would you
suggest, I would normally suggest just for loading a back squat.
You mean doing back squats on snatch day and front squats on clean day? That's typically what I'll do, but it kind of depends on the lifter. So
what if he's strong in the back squat and just needs more front squat?
Well, no, I'm thinking more of like recovery. So for example, if I have a lifter who, you know, if you squat them heavy at all, it takes them 14 months to recover.
You're trying to talk about me.
I'll probably put a back squat on the clean and jerk day, and that's going to be their big, like, just fuck up their legs day. So they basically got a full week. Yeah. But typically I'll do snatch and back squat together and clean. And
I think that's just one of our natural tendencies due to loading.
Right.
Because the snatch and the snatch pull just create less tonnage, and so you can do the higher tonnage squat movement.
Doing it that way will get those 2 days more balanced for sure. Mm-hmm. But then the other thing to consider is kind of your transition time between exercises. So for example, if you do snatch and then you go to snatch pull or snatch deadlift, there's 0 transition time. You grab your straps and you're already warm. You know, it's not like you got to break the bar all the way down to 40% to warm up for
and you don't have to re-warm up.
Right, you're ready to go, versus doing, say, like snatch and then doing back squat and then doing some snatch pulls. That's going to add a bunch of time, not only for just changing kind of equipment and things like that, but you've got to kind of re-warm up in some senses. So consider that, and consider kind of that flow of the workout and try to set that up in a way where you can transition as quickly as possible. And not, you know, add a bunch of time unnecessarily. Oh, you know what? One more thing I was thinking of when I saw this question. On the minutes. So doing sets on the minute, you know, primarily singles, but you can sometimes get away with doubles, or at minimum 1 minute rest if it's clean and jerk, is a really good way to kind of make your training more time efficient, but also, I mean, there's a lot of good benefits. I mean, I always say it originated with Joe Mills. I don't know that for a fact. He, at the very least, popularized it in the U.S., this on-the-minute training. And I use it quite a bit with my lifters and even myself. But it's a way to get in a bunch of training volume, a bunch of, you know, pretty good amount of weight, you know, tonnage, if you're looking at it that way. In a really short amount of time. But you also have kind of the side benefit that, you know, most people find that it's very effective for kind of developing technical consistency. Mm-hmm. And so you get a lot of good stuff out of that. Plus you get in better shape. So you can get up and down your stairs without taking a water break halfway.
I often, not often, but at times, particularly in the kind of towards the end of the conditioning cycles where there's they're working at higher percentages than they did, originally. So we're out of the 70s, we're somewhere in the 80s in terms of percentages, and I just want to make more work happen in a shorter period of time to increase essentially what would be considered in some form intensity. We do that as well as a tool for conditioning.
Yeah.
And so it has some other really good benefits. And I've had some of the best results from even beginners that have already been taught and gone through like the whole process of learning technique, because there's for them less time for them to sit around and dwell on like what's on the bar.
Exactly.
And so there's a psychological component to EMOMs that I think gets kind of ignored, and a lot of people will do better with an EMOM than they do in a regular setting or competition setting, just because I think the ability to sit down and sit there and think, oh my God, it's the max weight, blah blah blah, right, and all the other crazy things that go through weightlifters' heads that shouldn't. There's no time for that. I mean, they're just trying to catch their breath, and you're giving them just enough time for their heart rate to come down for them to go again.
Yeah, my heart rate does not come down.
Well,
not for cleans or clean and jerks.
Yeah.
Good God.
Snatch, I'm usually okay.
Yeah, snatch is fine. So that's a pretty good bunch of ideas there, wouldn't you say?
I think so.
Trent, you're set. Oh, actually, he said I find it hard to get into the groove. And to that point specifically, sticking with a workout that is, all snatch related or all clean related or all jerk, that's going to help too.
Yeah.
Neurologically speaking, I mean, if a lot of the old Soviet stuff comes back to that recommendation where you're kind of trying to concentrate on a single lift and variations in a training session for the purposes of motor learning, which I'll try to do in a lot of times too. All right. Are we ready to actually get to Rasmus finally?
Yeah, Rasmus, he has a chance.
He's got a chance. Hopefully he likes what he hears after waiting all this time. Rasmus asks, I would like to hear about recovery, both from day to day and also session to session, given 2 sessions a day. Found an article about recovery of Olympic weightlifters that indicates cold hot water treatments does not increase the recovery. And there's a link here. I'll put that link in the show notes there. Hope you can gain full access. So, without the cold/hot water treatments, massage, and sleep, of course, which recovery methods are your go-to methods? So, just for people who don't want to look at this, or if I forget to put the link in, the pertinent info in that study that he links, it says, cold water immersion did not prove to be an effective tool to enhance recovery in elite Olympic weightlifters over a 3-day intensive training period. Even though the group was rather homogeneous with regard to performance, there were considerable intersubject differences in their response to cold water immersion. It appears that athletes are best advised on a case-by-case basis. So there are also other the other studies I've read have kind of come to the same conclusion, where there wasn't necessarily a real clear answer on whether or not the cold plunge was effective. There also wasn't a clear answer on whether or not it was, had any negative effects. But someone sent me, I'm sorry, buddy, I totally forgot what your name was. I was going to give you credit, but someone responded to one of my newsletters and linked a study that showed there were some negative effects with regard to hypertrophy and even strength improvement with ice baths. And, we are talking about it with Ursula before the show started, similar in a sense to, coaches being against athletes taking ibuprofen because that anti-inflammatory effect can, theoretically limit hypertrophy. So there's definitely not real clear science on this.
Well, I mean, I don't think a study of people over 3 days is really, conclusive in terms of, I mean, it's obviously not done for a long enough period of time, following people over a long enough period of time. But I think Greg and I
don't get any hypertrophy in 3 days. Let's be honest.
Right. Anyways. And so the consensus, I think, I never understood ice baths or any kind of cold therapy as something that was necessarily done specifically for recovery as much as it was done for its anti-inflammatory effects. So maybe I was just off.
But I would
in
consider
terms of
that
how I always
an element
understood
of
that.
recovery, though, because
Sure, but
and
I wasn't looking at it. I mean, obviously, because it's vasoconstriction, you're not expecting. You're constricting blood to intentionally so that you reduce inflammation, which was counter all of the things that we do for recovery, though, that I know of for the most part, unless we put it like we're about to talk about, juxtapose it with a hot bath. The things that I was used to using were things like electrostim or sauna, and that's what we did primarily. We did a lot of every Thursday and Sunday we went to the sauna when I was training, and then stretching in the sauna.
Yep.
Dynamic stretching primarily, but some static stretching in the sauna. And those were like the kind of our go-tos. And then I started telling Greg some kind of funny stories about my experiences with some of the Russians or the Belarusians when I would go train in Belarus with my ex-husband. But I want go ahead and I don't want to impede Greg from his soliloquy on, because he has one prepared, I think, on contrast baths. Yeah. We talked earlier.
No, I mean, with the cold plunge specifically, and so I'm not talking about contrast. I'm talking about strict cold plunge. Like you're sitting in cold water for 5 to 10 minutes, and that's the whole thing. And so, yes, there's obviously that's anti-inflammatory. So in a period of training where you are just beat to shit, all your joints are aching. Maybe you're kind of in a competition phase. You got a competition coming up. So your primary purpose in this right now is to not feel like complete shit in the next day in the gym or in the next session. Then I don't see an issue with that. And I don't really have a concern with limiting hypertrophy and things like that. So the other thing too, keep in mind with weightlifting is hypertrophy is not a primary goal unless you have someone who's gaining weight. The improvements you get as a weightlifter are overwhelmingly through neurological adaptation. It's not because you're getting bigger. I mean, there's a reason that someone can stay in the same weight class for years and years and years and continue getting better. And that's certainly not because their muscles are getting bigger. And so that's one thing to consider. The other one to consider is that with the blood flow issue, yes, it's a vasoconstrictor to be in that ice and to be cold, but you're going to get that rebound effect where as the tissues warm up again, that blood is going to rush back in. And so you do get some of that constriction, dilation kind of contrast automatically, because you're not going to go in an ice bath and then go sit outside in the freezing cold in your skivvies for 2 hours and just stay cold. You're going to go and warm up somehow. Ursula might, I don't know. She'll go wander around in the forest
in
and
Texas.
pick mushrooms.
Oh,
in
well,
Texas,
that's somewhere else.
Hey, the last time I was in Dallas, there was an ice storm, so let's settle down.
You brought it because
actually that's not true. I've been there since. But anyway, so that's my thought on ice baths is that it appropriately dosed. It's not like if you do an ice bath periodically or even regularly, you're suddenly all your muscles are gonna shrink and you're gonna get weak. I think the concern with that is extremely minimal. And if you find that it's helpful, then keep doing it by all means. And which brings me to another point is that, first of all, when we talk about recovery, there's a lot of different things we could be talking about because, are we talking about kind of changes in hormone levels? Are we talking about soreness? Are we talking about range of motion? Are we talking about how you feel energy-wise? And so the bottom line is that a lot of times what we're talking about with recovery and restoration is subjective perception. It's how does that lifter feel? In other words, does that lifter coming into the gym chomping at the bit to put weight on the bar and go? Are they feeling quick? Are they talkative and happy and enthusiastic? Or are they finding every way to, put off tying their shoes and you just can't quite get them going? That's a legitimate part of recovery. I don't care necessarily what their blood hormone levels are. If someone comes in and they're enthusiastic and they're training well and That's the concern, is that subjective feel. And so with ice baths in particular, I have found with most people who do them, it's helpful in that subjective sense where they feel better and they feel more recovered and they want to get back to training. So that's my soliloquy on ice baths specifically. And so I guess his question was, aside from that, what methods are your go-to? But you know what? Contrast is a go-to method, because if your concern is, oh, well, I'm going to, stunt hypertrophy with ice baths, well, you can get a lot of the same, beneficial effects without any of those potential risks if you do contrast, and especially end in hot. But if you're really concerned, start in hot and end in hot. If anti-inflammation is your bigger concern, start in cold and end in cold. So there's ways to manipulate that where you're going to get a lot of the good effects, but change over, kind of what the net effect is. And so I would say that contrast is absolutely my number one go-to outside of sleep and nutrition. What say
Which
you to
there
this?
is no substitute for. Like has
Right.
to be
There is no
first.
substitute for sleep and nutrition. That's your foundation for everything. There's a reason why lifters who are essentially professionals do nothing but train, take naps, and eat, and do these recovery things. Like there's a reason they nap for like 4 hours a day. So
I always, when I was competing, I slept 9 hours a night. I thought
to be
8
young
was
again.
like what normal people should get, and as an athlete, you needed 9.
I'd take
And I
14
know that
if I could.
sounds like a lot to a lot of people, because I know a lot of people right now like run in the rat race that are they're like 4 hours or 5 hours of sleep,
but they're
and
going
I'm
to be
just like,
schizophrenic and die when
yeah,
they're
how
45.
do you even function? Like I still have a strong attachment to 8 hours. If I get anything under 6, I feel like I'm depriving myself. Like this is not right. And I know a lot of people who live on 6 hours. I mean, I'm almost glad that I kind of raised myself with that mentality, because I think it's really the adequate amount of sleep is like 8 hours. And if you're an athlete, you need 9 or 8 hours plus an hour nap sometime during the day. I just can't imagine how you're going to perform at a high level if your body recovers during sleep. And so you need that consistent sleep, like through the night, not little batches of it.
Well, and there are certainly outlier human beings who need less sleep, but it's important to distinguish between being able to survive
Right.
and being
Well, that's what I
healthy
think
and
happens.
high functioning. And those are two totally different things. You can survive on 4 hours of sleep a night, but you're going to be relatively useless. And so, yeah, don't trick yourself or pretend that that's going to work well for you.
Well, I
'cause
think
it's
a lot
not.
of people think that it makes them like really like resilient or tough
Nope.
if they can kind of just power through. And I'm just thinking to myself,
Well, it's tough,
this is
but that's not
the
necessarily a
place.
good thing.
Yeah, that's not the place that you want to be tough on yourself.
Yeah,
Like,
maybe
build
like
resiliency.
yeah, don't drink as much or something like that if you want to be tough and focus on, your performance and how badass you are. So
Yeah, I usually get mad if somebody comes in and tells me, I didn't sleep enough, and whatever the line of excuses are, because I mean that's something that you can, much like everything in life, whether we make excuses, that's something that you can adjust for, unless you just had a newborn child. Like that might be a legitimate excuse as to why you didn't get enough sleep.
right.
But everything else, I mean, you have control over what time you go to bed and what time you're going to wake up for the most part. And you can use the rest of the day to do the other things. You don't have to do, I'm really bad about going to bed late, but then I'll sleep late, Like I make sure that I get an adequate amount if I'm going to train. Now, if I'm not going to train and I don't have to be on top of anything except for maybe some brain function, then, it's possible to do less. But I'm sure I'm glad that I have a habit of a real reverence for sleep. And that comes from having been an athlete. I think all athletes should. I think all people should. I get really annoyed with people who act like sleep is just collateral in life. I'm like, no, it's fundamental.
Yeah, well, those people are rookies and don't understand what sleep is.
They don't understand how great it is.
Right. All right. So as far as other methods, so obviously sleep and naps, that's a big one. And I do think that even if you are getting a good quantity and quality of sleep at night, if you're training hard, pretty much doing anything in life, naps in like the early afternoon are hugely beneficial and very helpful. Even if it's 15-20 minutes and you're not actually sleeping, you're just lying down, quiet space, not worrying about other shit in your life. That's, I mean, pretty much across the board, anyone who's an expert in that field will tell you that's hugely effective. So the other ones that are maybe a little more accessible would be things like, foam rolling and stretching, where you're getting some more motion in, especially on off days. Being totally sedentary on a rest day is pretty much the worst thing you can do. You're going to end up being stiff, more sore, probably slow.
Day, yeah.
And so, yeah, some kind of moving, some dynamic, like doing your dynamic warm up on your rest days and then doing some static stretching, or stretching in the evening, foam rolling in the evening, things like that, I think are really, really helpful. And then I think one that really gets overlooked a lot in just kind of this general sense of recovery and restoration is getting outside, like having some kind of exposure to the outdoors. And that doesn't mean you're going to go climb a mountain. It's not, some super aggro, physically demanding activity. It just means getting exposure to sunlight and fresh air and perhaps even
if you have fresh air. We don't all live in Oregon.
Yeah, you know what? You live in Texas.
No, but I'm just saying, what about the people who live like in Guangzhou?
Well, they're gonna have trouble.
You can't go outside without a mask.
But see, that's something that they're gonna have to deal with.
Yeah, well, it doesn't appear to be impairing the performance of the Chinese lifters, so we'll just leave that alone.
Yeah, well, that's.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, I think
there are a lot of things going into that.
There's the kind of the meditation piece. I think what you're describing when you go outdoors is that same kind of relaxation and the anti-anxiety effect of just vegging outside. Even if you're doing something else, it's just taking your mind off of training, problems, worries, the stresses. And that, I think, goes a long way neurologically, because you're trying to get your nervous system to rest, not just a physical rest. That's why, for me, like laying down and trying to meditate, it just became 30 minutes of like trying to prioritize which bills I was going to pay first and, how I was going to manage the next day. Like, it never worked for me. But if I go outside and sit outside with my dog, then I'm watching him poke around, and all of a sudden I'm not thinking about things. And the nervous system actually has a chance to have some downtime. I think particularly for people who are kind of worriers by nature, which there tend to be a lot in weightlifting, you have to find something that's not just relaxing, but distracting in a way, so that you can get your mind off of numbers and problems and all of that kind of stuff. That's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to do, but goes a long way.
Absolutely.
Allowing the nervous system to relax and to rest. And very difficult for a lot of us.
I think that mental and emotional and psychological side of things definitely gets overlooked a lot. And kind of underestimated in terms of its effect on people physically. And so
stress.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, is stress is stress. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that emotional or psychological stress is going to be manifested physically, whether or not you want it to be. I have one lifter whose name I won't name, and she'll probably know exactly who I'm talking about if she ever listens to this. They always do.
I'll probably know too.
Who absolutely refuses to believe that there's a connection between what happens in the gym and what happens in the rest of life. Like super stressful work stuff, didn't sleep, all these things. Like, well, why do I feel terrible today? Why can't I make a PR today? It's like, are you fucking serious? Like, how have you not, seen these connections? But so I think it's easier to see, like, oh, I didn't sleep last night, so I'm going to feel crappy in the gym today. That it's easier to see a connection on something like that than it is like, oh, my girlfriend hates me right now,
Yeah.
so now I'm
Yeah.
lifting like
Just
shit.
like the
Or
distress of life.
yeah, but I think even specifically worries about weightlifting. So you have competitive lifters who are like you said, ones who are by nature worriers or kind of more anxious, who are constantly worrying about what their competition is doing. Like,
Mhm.
what did she lift today? What did she do at this meet? And they're on social media, like investigating constantly and freaking out about everything that they see. And that's one of my recommendations for people on rest days in particular. Don't look at any goddamn weightlifting stuff. Get off of Instagram. Take one day of your life and get off Instagram, and stop being
But
concerned
how
about
am I
what
going to get more
everybody else is doing.
followers?
God bless it. I
You
can't take
know,
it.
it's funny because periodically in life, I think just and for training for sure, you have to unplug. And if you know there's some source of stress, it's ironic that this is all like coming right now in this conversation. But I mean, I've had to do this really recently where I feel like I am creating stress for myself, and it impacts everything
Right.
negatively. And so, including your training, of course, and if you're primarily a weightlifter, then that's what matters the most, probably to you. And so, you advise your lifters, like, find the sources of stress and minimize them. And sometimes that means whether you're unplugging from a relationship that you have, or severing it, or
Yeah.
unplugging from social media, or getting off of it for some period of time. Like, sometimes you have to take the steps to allow the nervous system just to recover from the types of stresses. And even if they're, like what you're describing with lifters that worry a lot about making this team or that team, and we deal with that shit a lot, and being hyper focused on numbers and what other people are doing, like they have to find a way to disconnect. And all of that is a type of distress that taps the neurological system in much the same way that training does. And so for whether they need a sports psychologist so that they learn how to do that, or they can just are good enough to be able to take a nap and close their eyes and space out for a little while, which is always nice if
Yes.
they can do it that way, because it's cheaper than seeing a sports psychologist. Um, the other thing that, and I mentioned sauna, and I was going to tell, kind of an anecdotal story. When I went to Belarus, and the times that I've gone to Belarus, and I mentioned that we would sauna and stretch in the sauna, and then they would use those little birch tree things to smack yourself in the back. We're talking about just increasing circulation, blood circulation, to try to get byproducts out of the muscles and help the body recover. We would do it with cold plunges, and we would just do pull plunges, though. They weren't ice cold plunges. They were just cooler to bring your body temperature back down. And then you would go back into the sauna. Alternately, sometimes they would open the door and like jump in the snow, which of course was freezing cold. And then of course run back in and get back in the sauna. So like the period of time that you would spend in the ice versus the heat was disproportionate, with more time being spent in an element that's going to actually heat up your body and improve circulation versus the vasoconstriction part of it, of the ice or the snow. Or I was telling Greg about some of the experiences going into the forests and outside of Minsk, Belarus, and they like to pick mushrooms like it's a pastime. And anybody who knows maybe Soviet culture or whatever, they just go and they pick the gribami, the mushrooms, and they have like a basket and all this. And so another thing that they like to go out into the forest and do, it's not completely foreign. I mean, it's much like going to a park, except for these weren't actual like parks. It was just going into the forest. It's all public lands, right? So we go and cook shashliki or shish kebabs. And I was telling Greg a story about how one time, a couple of times, we went and the river's frozen, and they would like pick holes in the ice of the river. So, and here I am with like 3 pairs of socks, boots on. I literally burned the soles of a pair of my boots, like melted the rubber, because I had my feet so close to the fire because my feet were freezing cold. And here these guys are picking a hole out of the creek and like jumping into the ice water, and it's still ice cold outside. Like they're just, but they saw it as refreshing and part of just the recovery process. And so I don't think that, if we're getting science that's saying that it's not as effective, you're going to have to share that with a whole lot of different sports cultures around the world that have already attached themselves to this concept that the vasodilation effect of jumping in something ice cold, the zamiorzli or whatever, the walruses that do the ice plunges, it's pretty common to see that worldwide. And so my experience have particularly been in Belarus.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another good point, is that you can do some studies here and there, and you're measuring extremely specific things. Like I don't remember what this study we talked about was actually measuring, but if you take it as a whole, kind of this big picture thing, there are obviously multiple elements, both physically and, mentally, and kind of going back to that perception side of things. And so there is very obviously a net benefit to these kinds of things, or they wouldn't have such a big place for decades in high level athletes, training and regimens. And I think, especially look at the Soviet countries, it's not as if there was a dearth of scientific research going on with these athletes. I mean, they're like the most studied athletes in the history of the universe. Mm-hmm. So, granted, you could argue that there's better technology now, but I mean, come on. They would have figured something out if there was something that bad going on.
If there was something negative about it.
Yeah, they would have found a different way. I'm quite sure. So if you're freaking out about ice baths or contrast or whatever, don't do it. I'm not going to force you to do it. I don't care. I'm going to keep doing it. I've been jumping in the damn river here every day for the past week, and it's got to be like 12 degrees. And you know what? I feel fantastic. So that's my study right there.
You're going to have to push me in.
I do cold plunges and contrast all the time, and I feel better. Study complete.
I feel like my fingers are going to fall off.
Yeah.
I'm just a weenie when it comes to it.
And it feels like your bones are stinging, that's when you know it's working. I'm kidding. That's actually probably a little too cold, but all right, Rasmus, we did it.
Shatter when you stand.
Yeah.
You have effectively frozen yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And once you thaw out in the next month or two, you're gonna get a lot of new great blood flow. All right. Well, let's get out of here. Ursula, you need a nap. I need a nap.
Yeah,
or something.
I
mean, I won't take one, but
it's about that time.
Yeah.
I won't get one either, but I will go sit outside and watch my dog poke around in the grass for a minute or two.
Perfect. You're going to be so recovered tomorrow.
I will be for my 5 a.m. flight to Malaysia that's taking 39 hours.
No problem. You better start meditating now.
Yeah, I'll have 39 hours of meditation.
Good luck with that. All right, guys. We'll talk to you next time.
All right. See you guys.